This is the Miller philosopher. Can Sauron box? This is a question that came to mind when I saw one of the sequences from the Rings of Power trailer where Sauron disarms an elven guard and then kills him with his own sword. Nice move if I do say so myself, because I do a lot of sparring with swords, and that is a move I've done several times as well. But that's only part of what sparked this video, because what is Sauron known for in a fandom? He's known for being a Maiar, a deceiver, a forger, a shapeshifter, a strategist, and yes, even a great flaming eyeball. Though, let's be honest, if a flaming eye suddenly appeared in front of you, you're probably going to crap yourself too. But as a physical combatant, I suppose that shouldn't be that new to me, because the Peter Jackson trilogy does introduce Sauron quite literally smashing his way through his enemies in the Fellowship of the Ring, before he then fights Gil-galad off screen and Elendil. So yeah, I'm thinking, okay, Sauron can throw hands. Then I read the Silmarillion, The Fall of Numenor, and The Nature of Middle-earth, and then this question becomes more nuanced. Sauron gets his ass handed to him by Huan at Minas Tirith. No, not that Minas Tirith. And then disappears from the writings, only to assumingly be fighting in the War of Wrath at the end of the book with the rest of Morgoth's forces. And then after that, there's no mention of any direct combat with Sauron until the War of the Last Alliance. But in several other sources, it also says that Sauron was at the fall of Eregion before the Last Alliance, and was withstood by Celebrimbor before he defeated and then tortured him, and also had a personal guard with him during his war with the elves and later in Numenor, and that him and said guard were chased off after they were routed. So presumably this means he probably saw direct combat then, right? I mean, otherwise, why have a guard with you or put yourself in a situation where you can be chased off? That all implies seeing some action or being in the general area where you can do that. And let's say that was the case, why the difficulty? Why doesn't he just do what he did in Fellowship of the Ring, or how Collateral obliterated the orc captain in The Hobbit in the Battle of Five Armies? He's an immortal. He's a spirit older than time itself. Even with capped abilities, this should not have been a problem for him, I would think, at least. It seems that in most cases, Sauron is more of a master manipulator and schemer than he is a warrior. Almost as if getting his hands dirty is a last resort, unless he's torturing someone. And this also then touches upon the question of the combat abilities of other Maiar and Valar, and, to use a Dragon Ball Z term, power scaling them. For example, we know the five wizards had their powers capped, even Gandalf the White, so that they didn't cause collateral damage to the surrounding world like every other divine intervention had in the past. I mean, quite literally, Gandalf the Grey and Gandalf the White should have been doing what Sauron was doing in Fellowship of the Ring. Quite literally smacking away whole armies of orcs with no problem at all. He wouldn't need another army behind him, or even the Fellowship for that matter. He's a Maiar in and of himself. But even with that, he's operating within the limits that the Valar placed on him. And it seems to be power scaled in the sense that he can use as much as whatever he's fighting. Against orcs or other mortals, he can't really use that much. He just has to use a staff and sword. But against greater threats, such as the Balrog, and if he had been there, presumably Smaug, then he's allowed to use a little bit more power than he otherwise would have. We also have the case of the Balrogs, Maiar, who were spirits of fire and malice, and who has saw extensive combat during the First Age, and they are noted for carrying axes, swords, and whips of fire, and are noted on at least 2 occasions as being in direct combat with other elves. So obviously they had to have some combat ability as well, other than just scaring the shit out of people. And if I wanted to go with that adaptation version, we have Saruman, when he's fighting against the Nazgul as well, and how he just basically lays a smackdown on all of them using both his staff and the power within himself that seems to amplify that. Something that Sauron also does later during his fights, and I'm going to assume that it's an ability or a aspect whenever a divine spirit is using a portion of their being to amplify their combat experience. Sounds kind of something like from Star Wars, and it is, be honest, but there it is. And we also have Ianwe, noted as being the most powerful of the Maiar in Middle-earth, as well as being the supreme master of weapons in Valinor, despite being only a Maiar. And speaking of that, we have only 2 Valar who are noted for having any kind of direct combat experience at all, Tukas and Orome. To me, this implies that even with their powers capped, everyone else seems to just basically throw their powers around like throwing nuclear bombs all over the place, which is what causes so much collateral damage, Morgoth/Melkor included, and which is why that every time, like I said earlier, whenever they directly intervene in a war, it's not good for anybody. Essentially, it's like the Valar are like sentient nukes with no ability to not nuke everything around them, rather than just focus those abilities onto a specific target or person, like their Maiar can. And this is why I found that scene in Rings of Power Season 1, where Sauron is in a street fight with Númenóreans, so hilarious. This is the same guy who can dominate other people's will just by looking at them. This is the same guy whom, presumably, later on, we see smacking elves and men around like they were just figs at a tree. I'm not one to judge a person who's fighting, but honestly, this really does seem beneath him. Those guys getting their arms and limbs broken should be the least of their worries. Otherwise, I feel that the question of Sauron's combat abilities does imply that larger question, and also highlights the discrepancies in the power plays of the divine spirits when acting in war in Middle-earth. Whether it's in the books or in the movies, it's clear that they're only using a small fraction of the power available to them, and that if they were using their full power, then honestly there shouldn't be any armies, period. And also too, on that note, if Melkor was really that strong during the Wars of Beleriand, he could have just walked out there himself and then just completely laid waste to every army that came across to him by himself. He wouldn't need Balrogs and dragons and orcs or anything else. Just show up on the battlefield all by your fucking lonesome. Otherwise, I feel that the question of Sauron's combat abilities highlights these discrepancies, the biggest one, I think, being the morality aspect. That anyone who was evil should not have to worry about limiting their power, other than the natural caps put on them by Uru. They should be able to just go out there and just one-shot everybody, unless they encounter a more powerful spirit at that time, in which case then we can get larger areas of destruction. If anything, I can see that happening in the War of Wrath, in that I can imagine Ianwe was probably the one killing most of those Balrogs, and maybe that played a part in smashing Beleriand as it did, besides the fall of Calagon. That Sauron, even though he's not a Valar, is still a Maiar, and is still considered apparently one of the most powerful Maiar in Arda, arguably second to Ianwe. And that if this was the actual case, why the use of armies? Just walk up to Minas Tirith and start smashing the walls yourself. At least with the good guys, as it were, you can understand the self-imposed limitations they put on themselves to not cause as much damage. And it's discrepancies like these that I consider part of the unspoken mysteries of Middle-earth. And, like I said before, are implied by the question of, can Sauron actually fight? But, having said all that, this is the Miller Philosopher, and you guys have a good day.